let's start with a thought experiment. What group of children do you think deserve to get fewer educational opportunities? What child, if you found out that they did something typical to the ruling class, like graduate college, would you say, "Oh wow, good for you"? I bring these up because I think a lot of us would quickly say, "No, we need equality of outcomes." But I think it helps to understand a report I just wrote on special education funding in Georgia, because by many measures, Georgia has a typical special education program, maybe even in line with high achieving states. But I believe that that says less about how great our system is and more about the inequities that we allow to persist rather inside our education system. So let's get going. We have special education in Georgia because of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. This is a reauthorization of another federal law in the 1970s called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. I'm going to reiterate, these children did not have, we'll say, full access to the school until the 1970s. This was not a long time ago. Now, IDEA provides certain protections in a few areas: identification and evaluation, placement of students, the services that are provided, and then I'd like to add one more: funding. I'm adding funding because I work at the nonprofit, nonpartisan Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, and we believe that the budget is a moral document, and we strive to be anti-racist. First, identification and evaluation. This is an incredibly powerful way to view or understand special education. Is who do we identify to evaluate for services? Not every single disability is owed certain educational services, and there are going to be some children who are identified for services who maybe shouldn't be in the program, some who are not identified and who should. That misidentification, failure to notice, means that services are misaligned or they're just completely lacking. So let's do some quick hits as we look over identification. Georgia is 36th in the nation with how many of our kids are in special education. Georgia has 8.7% of the population. The median state nationwide has 9.6%. If we zoom in, is that equally distributed across all Georgians? No, it's not. As a portion of the population, more Black kids are in special education than white kids, and Asian American Pacific Islanders have much fewer as a portion of the population than all other student groups. This is a trend we see nationwide. 1997 reauthorization of IDEA, they tried to control for misidentification by saying that they mandated that special education eligibility is not determined by a child's language proficiency, like whether or not they grew up in a house that knows and speaks English, or discriminatory on a racial or cultural basis. So as we look at how many children, excluding Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, children of color are in our special education system, that could be due to cultural biases. It could also be due, there's a lot of research, to the way that we understand poverty's effect in children. Are there times where we are seeing a child who is not properly fed or is housing insecure, and instead identifying that as a child who needs special education services? There's a lot of research that is the case. And because there are generations of white supremacist policies, which make a connection between how much a family's money makes and the race of that family could explain part of why we have, for instance, so many black students in special education as a portion of the population compared to white and Asian students. There's another discrepancy that's even more stark based on cultural norms, is that, let's say in 2022, there were over 200,000 children with disabilities in Georgia. 142,000 of those were boys, 2/3. This discrepancy between boys and girls in special education probably says more about cultural expectations, what it means to be a good student, than it does about how many boys or girls have disabilities. On the identification front, the last thing I want to mention is that there's a significant difference amongst charter schools and traditional public schools in Georgia of how many of their students are in special education. So in 2021, fewer than 10% of students in charter schools were identified as students with disabilities, while over 13% of traditional public school students were the same. And there's a number of charter schools that have fewer than 5% of their students with disabilities. Like 13% of charter schools fit that description, while fewer than 2% of traditional public schools are the same. So there's a discrepancy there in where these children are being educated. Once you're identified for services, where do those services take place? This is the placement part. Because what we don't want, and what most states have experimented with, is a completely segregated classroom where your students with disabilities are taught away from the regular classroom. That's exactly what's defined as the regular classroom. That is hurtful to those children, and it doesn't benefit students without disabilities. And so there's a metric where states are required to report to the federal government how many of your kids are spending more than 80% of their time in a regular gen ed classroom. In 2021, 62% of students with disabilities in Georgia met that designation, where they're more than 80% of their time in a regular classroom. The average nationwide is 68.4%. So again, that puts Georgia behind the national average. We're likely to have more kids spending longer in segregated special education classrooms and not integrated into the regular classroom. If Georgia served the national average of students in the regular classroom, that would represent over 8,000 more students each year taught next to their classmates without disabilities. As we look at that kind of broken down by race, there is a stark difference. Children of color are much less likely to be educated in the regular classroom than their white neighbors. English language learners, they share a similar underrepresentation in the regular classroom. They have 22% fewer students in the regular classroom compared to the total share of students with disabilities that are learning English. But even if you are in that regular education classroom, there are other choices that can be made to remove a child from an education they deserve and need. And one that's brought up a good deal, justifiably, is discipline. How often are we seeing the effects of a child's specific disability, and that's being coded in our minds as disobedience? And how often is a child removed from the classroom for behavior that might not be attributable to like disobedience. It could be more attributed towards their disability. In 2014, students with disabilities represented 12.7% of the entire public school enrollment, but they represented over 21% of those in the disciplined population. So expelled, given detention, given in or out of school suspension. So they were 12.7%. They represented over 21% of the disciplined population. Fast forward to 2021, students with disabilities represented less than 15% of enrollment. So it's grown. And 27% of those in the disciplinary population. So you might be thinking, aren't there safeguards against a child being kind of over-disciplined? And there are, but they're really only triggered if the child has been suspended for 10 days in a row, has been suspended for more than 10 days total in the same school year, or if the school is considering expulsion. So there's a lot of leeway there where you can, a child can be punished several ways, and it might be more due to their disability, and that there's just not a strong method of accountability to support these students unless it gets beyond the pale. Now, what are the services offered to these children? And there's just a lot of ways to view the adequacy of these services. But here I want to rely on one just incredible data point, and it came out of a team at Georgia Institute of Technology that showed autism services and where they're offered statewide in Georgia. And there are 4 counties in Georgia that hold half of all the autism service providers in the state. In case you're not up on Georgia geography, we have 159 counties. 4 of them hold 49% of the autism service providers. Going even further, 25 counties only have a single provider, while 111 counties don't have one available at all. And it's rural counties. So sometimes schools might not be able to provide all the services that a child needs to succeed academically. Therefore, you're guaranteed supplementary accommodations. But if you don't have those accommodations in the community, like these autism service providers, then that puts increased pressures on schools to provide that within the school, and or sometimes those services just aren't available at all. This is the amount of pressure then we put on our rural special education teachers explains why these are the schools, rural schools, were more likely to report difficulties in recruiting and retaining special education teachers. So as we look at what services are being provided, one thing that's really interesting is, does the teacher resemble the classroom? Now, this isn't to say that a white teacher can't provide an excellent education to black students, but we cannot ignore the strong body of evidence that shows that students perform better, everyone perform better, if we were to have more teachers of color in the classroom. Long story short, special education teachers do not resemble Georgia's racial and ethnic diversity. More than 62% of the special ed population in Georgia are children of color, while only 34% of the teachers are. Children who identify as ethnically Hispanic have the least representation amongst their teachers. 16% of students with disabilities are Hispanic, but less than 2% of the teachers are. One big part of this might be because of salaries. We can even see that within schools, that special education's teachers are paid less based on how many, if you have higher portions of students living in poverty. Student poverty is something that I want to harp on for just a second because it's evident in every part of our education system. And we can see a direct connection between how students perform on state tests, in how our students with disabilities perform, and how many of these children are living in poverty. That the more, when you get to 80, 90% of your students living in poverty, a lot of these school districts have zero children with disabilities passing the English milestone state test. But when you get like fewer than 20, 10%, then the average gets closer to half of the students with disabilities passing that state test. And so that is just evident in all levels, and helps to explain just kind of like that there are different services being offered to students with disabilities based on how many of them are living in poverty. Now, as we talk about the funding provided to these programs, it gets a little wonky, but maybe that's where I've been this entire time. But just let me quickly talk about each of them. Fiscal incentives. Georgia has a weighted program, which means the more children you have in special education, the more your school gets to fund to educate these kids in state funding. That can incentivize school districts to have more children in the higher cost programs because then you're getting additional funding. Best evidence we have is that we do not see that here in Georgia. Georgia is already behind the national average in how many children are identified for special education, and there's no connection between how much money the school district has, like in local property taxes, which is a good stand-in for whether or not they're strapped for cash, and how many kids they have in special education. So I do not see a connect. I do not believe or cannot see it in the data, this idea that school districts are somehow over-identifying children in order to get additional money. The next is the funding and cost alignment. Like, is Georgia sending enough to school districts to align with the costs? Now, this is really interesting because Georgia has not had a systematic change to how we fund special education in Georgia in a very long time. We have added money into the formula, but it's just into that base amount. And as I said before, funding for Georgia's special education program is weights, and it's weights above that base amount. So let's say that the base amount is keeping up with inflation. It's not, but let's say it is. What if the cost to educate a child with Down syndrome has actually gone up faster than inflation for one reason or another? Georgia's system is not nimble enough to provide the schools the resources they need to serve children well. When we align that funding and costs, we haven't really reviewed that in a long time, and so it has to be something that we do moving forward. And then transparency and ease of implementation. The weighted formula can be a little wonky, needs regular maintenance. Georgia has made just tiny changes to the funding weights, but has not changed the student to teacher ratio since 2006. Now, I said at the beginning that Georgia's special education system is typical of other states. And I mean that. I looked at Georgia compared to other states based on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. This is kind of the gold standard of comparisons between states. Let's look at Georgia's 8th grade reading scores. This shows students with disabilities achieving similar levels of high-performing states. Only 6 states in the nation performed higher. Georgia's, on the same assessment, Georgia students with disabilities score closer to students without disabilities than most states. But the problem is that there's still a huge gap between how students with disabilities do on state tests and students without disabilities do. It's just something I feel like we've become normalized to. There are other areas in a child's life where the United States, it says that should not be a reason that this child does worse on state tests. Imagine if we went back and saying like, oh yeah, girls perform worse in this class, you know, and that's just something we lived with. No, there's this American recognition, or ought to be, that all children deserve equality of outputs, which means that we give all children the opportunities they need to succeed, and that might look like more resources for children who need them. We know that we provide additional funding to educate English language learners, students with disabilities, but just because we provide some more money for students with disabilities, when we look at the outcomes, are we still okay with those children performing qualitatively lower on these state tests than other students with disabilities? And I would say no. What could we as a state do to provide more opportunities for this group of students? I've got a few policy implications. And one might sound like it's a little bit of a stretch, but we are in desperate need of a robust investment in the publicly available special education data. We just label kids as with a disability or without a disability. That completely glosses over a wealth of diversity in children's experiences. Because a child who has difficulty seeing might be experiencing school completely differently than a child who has ASD. But we're putting just both of those children as a child with a disability. We need to be able to see the intersectionality of race, disability, gender, income, so that we can see what areas of our public school system really need support. What areas do we need to be investing in? Do we need to be supporting? And that is hard to do if we just use, the 13 categories of disability that are provided from the federal government. The next one that I would like to offer is that we need additional funding to educate students living in poverty. We need to support low-wealth school districts so that all schools have the resources they need to educate every child to a high-quality education, and that needs to be flexible to the needs of the child with disability, to the child with disabilities. If we're not willing to put additional resources there, then it is almost this tacit admission that we're okay with how things are right now. Finally, we need Georgia lawmakers to convene a comprehensive review of the funding associated with special education. There's been small tweaks to the funding weights over the years, but we have no assurance that the state is providing schools enough to educate students with disabilities to our world-class standards. And this is going to take more than just an individual report from GBPI. This is going to need to take lawmakers, parents, disability advocates, people who are serious about how to improve special education and the education for all students with all disabilities moving forward, need to also be serious about public input, the everyday experiences of students with disabilities and their families, and be willing to hear real feedback about the system. And until we do that, until we continue to make tweaks without public engagement, it sends a signal to these children and their families that they do not deserve kind of full representation inside the schoolhouse. And so that's the conclusion, is that we need to have robust data sets and data gathering for these students. Obviously, that values privacy, but empowers families in the state and school districts to serve students well. We need to have an opportunity weight, some more funding to educate students living in poverty that's adjustable to child's needs. And finally, we need to have a systematic review of special education funding in Georgia moving forward.